Member for Mawson.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. I too rise to support this motion and to send my condolences and love to the people of Christchurch, and to wish them and all New Zealanders everywhere and all Muslims everywhere God's strength as they come to terms with what has been an absolutely horrific act. Back in July 2016, I was in Christchurch with my son on a holiday, and we were walking through this city that, as people have mentioned, is a sister city to Adelaide, and very much took on a lot of the design characteristics of Adelaide. And we were walking through those streets, and it was 5 years after the devastating earthquakes that had killed 185 people and flattened so many buildings in that city, and in fact had displaced thousands and thousands of people. And it kind of felt sad to be walking through there and knowing that buildings once stood where now there was just empty spaces, and that buildings once stood where now there were shipping containers that had been turned into souvenir stalls and other shops. But then we started talking to the people, and they had an amazing resilience and an amazingly optimistic outlook, despite the physical characteristics of their city being so devastated and the makeup of their city being so torn apart because of the fact that so many people had left Christchurch. One of the things that really stood out was a neon sign that was about 25 to 30 metres long, and it went along the entirety of a building. And we walked past this at about 7:30 at night, middle of winter, and each of the letters was in a different colour on this neon sign, and it said, "Everything is going to be all right." And I think that sums up the attitude of those people of Christchurch, and we wish them well over the coming weeks and months and years, because this is going to take a lot to deal with. And I think it's been interesting to see the political reaction to this as well. And I don't think anyone could fault New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern. She has done an amazing job. She has proved herself to be an outstanding leader. But I think the reaction here in Australia has also been good as well. Over the weekend, we saw our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, stand side by side with members of and leaders of the Muslim community in New South Wales, while at the same time the opposition leader, Bill Shorten, was in his home state in Victoria doing the same thing in Melbourne. And I just hope that this coming together can continue, because this person who committed this atrocity is an Australian. And I think we have changed over the past 2.5 decades to the Australia that we were perhaps in the 1970s, when we had Malcolm Fraser as our Prime Minister. Here in South Australia we had Don Dunstan as our Premier. And I think we were then a much more tolerant, loving, caring society as a nation and indeed as a state. I remember at school having the best lesson on compassion and love and understanding, not from the priests and brothers of the De La Salle community at St Michael's, but by a kid called Tony Englehart, who was a refugee from Vietnam, whose body was covered in blisters and scars from a napalm attack. And Tony Englehart taught me about what it was all about to be welcoming and to see that it didn't matter what you looked like, it didn't matter where you came from, it didn't matter what your religion was. We're all human beings. We have a governor now who was a refugee from Vietnam. We were so welcoming. In 94, 95 until early 96, I lived in Switzerland, and I went over there, and the war that was taking place in former Yugoslavia was seeing widespread atrocities, deaths, and there were a lot of refugees fleeing out of there. And I was talking to Swiss people who didn't want to welcome any of these people as refugees. And I proudly told them how we were a wonderful multicultural country in Australia, and that we had a Prime Minister, Paul Keating, who was espousing the virtues of embracing Asia and making sure that the people of our country weren't xenophobic in their attitude to those who may come from a different part of the world or practice a different religion to some other Australians. And so for 2 years, living in Europe, I was telling this story about what a wonderful multicultural country we are and how we welcome people from around the world. And we've had wave after wave of migration. And our state, and indeed our nation, has been built on these waves of migration. And then I returned home to live in Adelaide in early 1996, and there was the federal election campaign on. Turned on the television, and there's a guy with a big hat called Bob Catter, who I'd never seen before, and he was talking about slanty-eyed ideologues. And then there was this other woman turned up who owned a fish and chip shop in Queensland, and she was saying that we were being invaded by Asians and that she spoke for 90% of Australians. And I couldn't believe that I was actually hearing people who wanted to put their hand up to be in the federal parliament speaking that way, and it just seemed so far removed from the Australia that I'd left 2 years earlier. And then I think what we saw was this sort of inflaming of racial hatred by some of these far-right politicians. And what followed then, I think, was perhaps a dropping of the guard by both major parties. And what followed after September 11 also played a role, I think, in perhaps not being as fair and as compassionate to people from overseas. We saw the Baxter Detention Centre, the Woomera Detention Centre, where people like Saeed Safavi, who now has a great little cafe in Port Pirie, he was a refugee from Iran, and he was locked up in Baxter and Woomera for about 2 years. So I think we may have made some mistakes and we may have lost our way. But what we saw on the weekend with the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, and with the opposition leader, Bill Short, was it was actually coming together and joining with those of Muslim faith in Melbourne and Sydney to send a message to all Australians that we must return to that place of understanding and that place of compassion. Because that is the only way we're going to defeat these far-right fundamentalists. And they do live amongst us. They are on social media and they are propagating some fairly awful hatred towards people from different countries and different religious beliefs. I think Senator Fraser Anning has been widely criticised, and so he should. And I know the Labor Party has come out today federally and said that they are going to put Fraser Anning last and also encourage people to put One Nation last at the upcoming federal election. And I'm sure that the Liberal Party is also giving that consideration as well. And I think that's something that we need to do. It's, if any good is to come out of the horrific situation in New Zealand from last Friday, then may it be that Australians change the way they view these right-wing extremists who live within us. And I think it's incumbent on all politicians, regardless of which party we are in, regardless whether we're in state or federal parliament, to call it out as well. And I think what we saw last year after Pauline Hanson turned up in the burqa was a terrific speech by George Brandis, And I think that's what we need to do, and is to actually congratulate those who are brave enough and strong enough to speak up, and then that we absolutely condemn those who add fuel to the fire of hatred and right-wing extremist views. The other thing that we've seen come out over the past 4 or 5 days, and we saw it immediately because this killer, not only did he do this awful thing, but he streamed it live through Facebook and used social media in a way that I don't think we have ever seen used before, is a change in MO, and something that media, both traditional media and social media, have to really get on top of and change the way things are done. And if that requires federal and state changes to legislation, then we all need to work on that as well. During Bill Shorten's press conference and during Scott Morrison's press conferences that were streamed live over the weekend, I was watching them on Facebook through the television network's coverage, and people were allowed to comment on there. And the sort of comments that were being made were full of hate. And there must be a way that media organisations can actually just cut that out. And perhaps in the extreme cases, that the police and other agencies can chase those people up who are sort of saying some of the things that they're saying on social media. So we'll return now to the people of Christchurch and to that sign that was erected after the earthquakes. Everything is going to be all right. Well, let's hope it is, not just in Christchurch, but in our part of the world as well. I commend this condolence motion to the House.